the Go Fast and the Gimbal videos that you mentioned earlier. There was like, what's interesting there to you?
So the gimbal, I'll talk about that one first. I was airborne for that one. The person that recorded it is a good friend of mine. But I mean, both air crew, I knew both of them, but the Wizzo himself, very close friends with, went through a lot of our training together. We went to the same fleet squadron. He ended up transitioning to be a pilot and then came to where I was instructing. So I got to instruct him a bit on his transition. And, you know, the way that was we went out on a air-to-air training mission. So simulating a air fight against our own guys. They're acting like the bad guys and kind of go head-to-head against each other. And when we fly out on those missions, we all fly out together, more or less. We set up, and then we kind of attrite from the fight as we either, you know, run out of gas or something happens. And so people usually go back onesies or twosies. And so the air crew that recorded the gimbal, they were going back to the boat, and we were on what's called a workup training event. And so this is like a month on the boat where we're essentially conducting wartime operations, more or less, to stress ourselves out and to kind of do the last training block before we go on deployment, essentially. So it's pretty high stress. They actually do send aircraft from like land bases to kind of try to penetrate, and we're expected to go intercept them. And so we're kind of practicing like we play. And so he saw these objects on the radar, the gimbal, and a fleet of other aircraft or vehicles. And they initially thought it was part of the training exercise, that they were sending something in to try to penetrate the airspace. And so they flew over to it, and as they got close enough to get on the FLIR, I think everyone has heard their reaction, and they realized that it wasn't something they were expecting to see.
Can you actually describe what's in the video and what's the reaction in case they haven't seen it?
Yeah, a lot of swearing. But so what you see on the FLIR footage is a black or white, depending on when you look at it, object that's somewhat shaped like a gimbal. It appears almost as if someone put two plates together, and then there seems to be almost like a small funnel of IR energy that's at the top of the bottom of those plates, in a sense. So almost as if, there's a stick going in between two plates, but not that pronounced, right? So there's an energy field that kind of went to a funnel on the top and the bottom. At least that's how it's being portrayed on the FLIR. There's a lot of conversation about that being glare, things of that nature, but it was actually a very tight IR image. It just was nondescript shape, which was interesting. Typically, we would see the skin of the aircraft. We can see the flames coming out of the exhaust, especially at those ranges.
And there was no flames, or there's no exhaust here.
There was no exhaust. There was no, there was no outgassing of propellant in any manner, right? It was just an object that had nothing emitting from it that was stationary in the sky. Well, not stationary, but it was moving along a path, right? It wasn't falling out of the sky. And it continued along. If we were to consider it from a God's eye view, again, on the SA page, it continued along in a path. And from the perspective, that top-down view, it just went another direction. So no, just an instantaneous direction change from that perspective. You also hear them, very excitedly talking on the tapes about, whatever the heck this thing is. And look at the SA, there's a whole formation of them. And so the SA is a situational awareness page. And again, it's a large display that gives that God's eye view of all the radar context.
So the video is actually showing just one. And then they're speaking about many of them.
Correct.
On the SA display.
Correct. And what they essentially saw was, if we were to consider above the object north, so kind of offset to the north of the object, there was a formation of about somewhere between 4 and 6 of these objects in a rough wedge formation, so kind of side by side like this. Mm-hmm. And again, not in a like autopilot type manner where it was very stiff. It was very kind of non-mechanical, the flight mechanics, mm-hmm. again. And these objects were in that formation, and they were going along, and then they turned pretty sharply, but they still had a radius of turn, and then went back in the opposite direction. And during that turn, they were kind of like all over the place. Like, it wasn't tight. They weren't even like they weren't flying in a way I would expect them to be flying in relation to a flight lead. They were flying as if they were flying close to each other, but not in formation, which was kind of strange, right? And then when they rolled out, they kind of tightened back up. Like, so when they started that turn, and then 180 degrees out, essentially, they started flowing in the opposite direction and kind of got back in that formation. And while that was happening, the gimbal object was proceeding, was they left to right. And as those, the formation kind of turned up to the north and was just passing back it, the gimbal just kind of went back in the opposite direction. So to follow it back in that direction. And in the FLIR itself, you see the object changes orientation quite a bit. So you see it more or less level, maybe canted about 45 degrees. And then you see it kind of moving around like this, almost as if it was a gimbal. Mm-hmm. I've come to learn after some, having seen some research online and people really looking into this, that it seemed that the object actually climbed during that maneuver. And so the reason it looked like it turned immediately is because it turned like this. It turned in a vertical fashion like that, which was pretty interesting. That's kind of like another example of a flight mechanics that we don't normally operate, because we don't change our directions by maneuvering in the vertical if we can help it. You're just killing the fuel, and so if you're like a surveillance platform looking to spend as much time around something, you're not going to climb 500 feet every time you make a turn,
unless you're Tom Cruise.
Naturally.
Okay, so is that one of the more impressive flight mechanics you've seen in video form? So not the direct eyesight reports, but like in terms of video evidence that we have.
I think so. We were seeing a lot of these, but we weren't just going on recording them all day. We just kind of put them in that safety bucket, be like, all right, there's objects over there. We're just not going to go near it, And so we weren't putting our sensors on them that much. So we were gathering the data kind of secondarily, but we weren't primarily focusing on it to see all the details. So
that's so fascinating, because you have a busy day, you have a lot to do. All right, well, there's some weird stuff going on there. We're just not going to go there. And that says something about sort of about human nature, about the way that bureaucracies function, the way the military functions. It fills up your day with busy, important things, and you don't get to. That is something that I'm, in a sort of absurd way, worry about, which is like we fill our days with so much busyness that when truly beautiful things happen, whatever they are, truly anomalous things, we just won't pay attention, because they don't fit our busy schedule.
Mm-hmm. Beautiful. I think that's right on the nose. And it's on my nose because, I didn't give this topic the attention it deserved until I left, right? Until I left and I went to be an instructor pilot, where I had more time. I had more downtime to kind of process and think and get out of exactly what you just described. And that's kind of what broke me out of it and got me thinking more about it.